Show. This week I've got a very interesting story about another very interesting historical figure, this time a pioneer in America, the founder of the Baptist Church, I believe, in America, Roger Williams, who was many other things, including a pioneer in standing up for the rights of Indians, and he was a very interesting civil libertarian. Plus, this week, of course, we have this week's painting behind me here, which I've decided to call, what was it? Abstract Coral. I think because it's a bit like coral. Anyway, who was this guy called Roger Williams? Well, he was born in London in 1603, grew up in London, and he became a Church of England minister. He soon bored with that, of course, and ventured into Puritanicalism and became a Puritan. And being a Puritan at that time in England was particularly awkward, especially as King James I came to power, even though Puritans thought that was going to be in their favour. In actual fact, they became more monitored and eventually persecuted. And they had to use the Common Book of Prayer, which wasn't to their liking. So, a group of them hightailed it to America in 1620, and they were followed 10 years later by this chap, Roger Williams, and his wife, 1630. So yeah, in 1630, Roger Williams and his wife arrived in America. Now, he was a chap, it would seem, who became bored with the mundane ideologies of the time, because that's exactly what happened. He was given a post as a minister in Boston, and he soon ruffled the feathers of the village elders there, the church elders, and so he had to leave that particular post in Boston, and he took up another post in Salem. However, when he got to Salem, his position there was soon quashed by the religious authorities, because he started espousing ideas of Indian rights and separation of the church and state and things like that, you see, that weren't too popular. So he moved to Plymouth. In Plymouth he questioned the church and the state, and yeah, he stood up for Indian rights. So therefore he became a bit of a black sheep, if you like, in the colonies. Anyway, he mastered the Algonquin language, the Indian language, and made alliances with the chiefs as he became quite interested in Indian culture. And he came to see that the Indian perspective was more in agreement with what he believed to be more just, and he became to see the European perspective on particularly land rights as misguided and unjust. So, eventually, the General Court of the colony had enough of his preaching about Indian rights and the separation of the church and state and so forth, to the point where they expelled him from the colonies. He had to be out of their jurisdiction in 6 weeks. Well, what was he to do? He had a wife and a 2-year-old little girl. So just before the 6 weeks is up, he legged it, basically. He took off inland in a howling snowstorm, and somehow he survived, and he met up with some friends of his who were Indians in a village. And then he basically created his own little village, which was soon joined by his wife a few weeks later, and other sympathetic Europeans who shared his viewpoint on a more, shall we say, liberal perspective of Indian and European relations. So, he lived in this harmonious, a fairly harmonious village with Europeans and Indians, which was pretty much free of conflict, interestingly enough. However, eventually he worked out that, in fact, the land was on Puritan land. So he had to move the village. He moved it to another place and called the village Providence. It was, of course, on the Rhode Island. After a ferocious war with the Indians, he opened up a very successful trading post, and he wrote a book called The Key into the Languages of America, which included the Narragansett language, I don't know if I've correctly pronounced that, an Indian language, explained in the book. He went to England and obtained a charter from the Parliament granting, and then for his village, and then he came back and he was granted free passage through Boston, because he was a bit of an outlaw in those days, and in fact he was cheered by people as he went out to Rhode Island. He became an advocate against religious persecution, and he published The Bloody Tenet of Persecution. Yes, he advocated the idea of separation of church and state, and he stood up for Indian rights. Eventually there was a war called King Philip's War, where it was a particularly nasty war, whereby every Indian village was burnt to the ground in the area of New England, and all remaining Indians were sold into slavery. Over 1,000 colonists died, and even Roger Williams, the peace-loving Roger Williams, had to fight in the war. Eventually he died at the age of 80, however his legacy did not. He influenced such people as Thomas Jefferson, William Penn, and even the English philosopher John Locke, and several very important early civil libertarians. And of course he influenced the writing of the US Constitution with the idea of separation of church and state, etc. And he was, like I've already said, he was a pioneer really in standing up for the rights of indigenous Indian people. So there you are. I think he's a very interesting character, actually. A very courageous and conscientious person in the annals of American history. Thanks a lot for watching my latest video. I hope you like the new painting. It's a bit different, and it's acrylic. And thanks a lot for subscribing lately, if you have. Comments and ratings. Keep it all up. Thanks a lot. Have a fantastic week. I'll see you again next week. Thanks.